Well, good evening, everyone. It is 7, so we'll go ahead and get going. I'm Amanda Newell. I'm with Cascadia Conservation District, and we've got my colleague Kirk on here. You'll hear from him in a bit. Thank you so much for joining us for Native Planting 101. This is our second session of this year, and I just wanted to do a quick shout out to Washington Department of Ecology. They're providing funding for our staff to coordinate this workshop series. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with Cascadia, we're non-regulatory, we're local here in Chelan County, and we're dedicated to encouraging wise stewardship and conservation of all natural resources. We're governed by a board of supervisors, and then our staff work closely with local landowners and residents, helping with any conservation needs. We have a lot of different programs that provide technical assistance and cost share funding, all of them voluntary. And we also have a lot of great partners. So we just really encourage folks to reach out to us, and we likely have a program that can help you, but if we don't, we're happy to connect you with a partner as well. And then as part of that Department of Ecology funding, a focus and importance is water quality. So just kind of wanted to tie that into why we recommend using native plants. So they are well adapted to, and I hope I'm not stealing too much of your thunder, Mel. I'll try to keep this brief, but they're well adapted to our climate. The wet winters and dry summers require less water and less work to get them established. And they're also more resistant to pests and diseases. They do improve water quality because we don't need to use as much fertilizer and pesticides to keep them healthy. And then they just encourage a sense of stewardship, keeping things native and place-based. So again, I mentioned we have a lot of different types of programs. So just to briefly mention a few, we've got agriculture team that does things like irrigation upgrades, soil testing, wildlife and pollinator habitats. We have a couple of archaeologists on staff, and then we do a lot of community outreach and engagements. We do like social media and website, print newsletter and brochures, and then we're out at a lot of community events like Earth Day fairs all around the county. And then we do have a couple of bilingual staff now, so we've been really trying to up our Spanish outreach as well. And we have a large wildfire preparedness program. We have cost share, different types of cost share, and we also offer chipping and free yard waste dump days out at Chelan Transfer Station. We've recently gotten more involved with prescribed fire, so we do these learn and burn activities around the county, and then we do help with some post-fire restoration as well. And then down on the stream level, we do habitat restoration and wetland restoration. We do a lot of native plant installation along the stream there, the riparian area. And then we also do installation of beaver dam analogs. And then we also have a real robust youth education program for really from K through 12. So we have week and after school programs and summer camps for our elementary students. We do kids in the snow, kids in the forest and orchard for our middle school students. And then we have a long running, like 30-year now running high school program called Kids in the Creek. And then also quick invite to everyone. We're hosting a conservation fair on March 25th at Pybus, and that is a chance to come meet all of our staff in person, learn more about our programs. Refreshments will be provided. And then we also have our Board of Supervisors election going on, and we'll have a prescribed fire class through Pybus U that evening after the fair. And then, yeah, just all of our contact information there. Like I said, we're happy to chat with you about any natural resource you have. And even if we don't have a program for you, we've got lots of great partners to connect you with. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kirk.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us. So we have after Mel's talk tonight, we have 2 more virtual sessions. Natalie next week and Al the week after that. And Natalie is a board member of the Washington National Plant Society Central Washington chapter. Al's a retired forester with lots of wildfire expertise. So they're be great presenters, and be glad to have them Al back, and we're excited to have Natalie join us for the first time next week. And we also have coming up on May 10th from 3 to 5 in Peshastin an in-person native plant workshop. And we limit it to 25 people so we can all gather around plants, and 4 speakers will be there, and they'll give us their views about the different plants. So it's a fun time. We've done this for 3 or 4 years now. And because it's limited to 25 people, it is a lottery sign up. And we don't advertise it except for this virtual sessions. And I'll put the link to that registration in the chat here in a minute. But if you're interested, sign up and we'll do a lottery for the top 25. So. And tonight we have Mel. We're really excited to have her back, and she's going to be getting us started with native plants. And so Mel's the owner of Derby Canyon Natives in Peshastin. She was born in Michigan and received a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Biology from Michigan State and a Master's in Wildlife Habitat Management from Texas A&M. And then she came to Washington State in 2004, started with WDFW as a range ecologist, and then moved into the private sector and worked for BFI Native Seeds as a restoration ecologist for 11 years. Like I said, she's now the current owner of Derby Canyon Natives as of January 2022. Her work includes native seed collection, native plant propagation, as well as working with lots of students. We have a group of students going to her place tomorrow. So, Mel, turn this over to you, and thanks very much for joining us. And
if we can get this going.
So yeah, we're having a little technical issues. We've got that gray box that there, and we fiddled with it for a little bit before we get started, but looks like we're going to be stuck with them, but got them figured out so they're a little smaller. So sorry about that.
Yeah, apologies. It appears to be an issue on my end, and it's beyond our Zoom capabilities to fix. So yeah, I've got to keep all of the Zoom screens down, kind of minimized on my screen so that they don't kind of show up as that gray box. So when we stop to take questions, Kirk, could you possibly read them to me from the chat?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, great.
And yeah, and folks, you feel free to put questions in the chat throughout, and then we'll stop every so often and answer.
We've got a couple of dedicated stops to address questions. So Kirk, are we seeing the gray boxes minimally right now?
Minimally, yeah. They're not a problem at all. So
okay, great, thanks. Okay,
if you could
great.
color them, it would actually add a little, pizzazz to it.
Thanks. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Kirk and Amanda, and to Cascadia for hosting this webinar every year. Appreciate the opportunity to address many people at once on the topic of native plants, which is my favorite thing to talk about, as anybody knows me. The presentation today is really going to cover kind of a really basic getting started approach to native plant gardening, kind of intended to be really introductory, for folks who are just either getting into this or entertaining the idea of getting into it. Just some things to think about, some pitfalls, some highlights, etc. As an overview, first we're going to talk about, kind of define what natives are. So that is a point of confusion for many people. And then talk a little bit more about why we should consider planting them, although Amanda did a good job of addressing that as well. And then we're going to spend most of the presentation taking a dive into kind of two example plant palettes, one for the lower Wenatchee Valley and one for the upper, and kind of talk about some of my favorite plants and easiest to grow plants for those two different sites. And then we'll get into kind of the nuts and bolts of seeding or planting, and finally maintenance, and how it might be a little different than a traditional landscape. So what are native plants? The definition that I found that is my favorite is this: it's a plant that is a part of the balance of nature that has developed over thousands of years in a particular region. In our region, that's 10 to 15,000 years since the last ice age. And so at lower elevations and east, and, the eastern area of our region, that's shrub steppe plants, so sagebrush and other shrubs and bunch grasses and flowers. There's a huge diversity of species that grow in that habitat type. And then at middle or higher up elevations, you get into trees like ponderosa pine, Doug fir, and then a diversity of understory species like the lupins and balsam root pictured here. And of course, we also have a completely different suite of plants, native plants that occur along riparian areas and streams. And it's important to kind of keep in mind where a particular native plant came from if you're considering growing it in your yard, because it'll tell you a lot about how to care for it. So why do I think we should plant natives in our landscape? Well, a big reason is that they are adapted to a pretty unique climate that we have in north central Washington. And ideally, with plants adapted to the climate, from the appropriate site, you'll have a lot less watering. And then it's kind of a growing trend, but this idea of gardening for wildlife is really picking up steam across the country. And so folks are interested in not just having a beautiful backyard, but having a backyard that is a part of the local community and harbors habitat for all sorts of wildlife. So, just a few general ideas that are always a good place to start when you're talking about any sort of gardening, and native gardening in particular. So if you come to the nursery, these are the things that we're going to talk about first if you're asking us for recommendations for your yard. Location. Are you down in Wenatchee? Are you up in Manson? Are you up by Lake Wenatchee? These are really different and unique planting sites, and they've got challenges associated with each. Sun exposure, soils. Betsy gave a great presentation on soils last week. I recommend checking that webinar out if you didn't catch it last week. It'll be available on the website. And then, of course, goals. People have different goals for their landscape. Some folks might just be interested in, growing as many plants for butterflies that they want. And some people might just be really interested in having as, drought tolerant species as possible for minimal watering. So these are all kind of critical things that you need to figure out before starting to plan. And then I think one really important thing that needs to be addressed when you're thinking about a native plant gardening is staggering blooms. And so selecting species that bloom from spring to fall. Native plants, because they aren't bred as ornamentals are, have a narrower bloom window. And so if it's important to you to have that, particularly for pollinator habitat, you've got to be really deliberate with a selection for species that bloom across the season. in our area, late summer and fall bloomers are the trickiest. And so we've got a ton of species that bloom in the spring and early summer. This picture was taken in June, and this is of the nursery landscape, and it's just beautiful. But it's a little trickier finding those species that will start to bloom in July or August, or even bloom all the way up till frost in the fall. So particular attention should be paid to that. And then if diversity for wildlife habitat is your goal, then just, the more species, the more different species you can include, the better. The more, different butterflies or moths or birds your habitat will support. So diversity is critical. So there's a lot of great information that you can find online when you're starting to plan your garden. And I think our website is a great place to start. So derbycanyonnatives.com. I've got tabs on the website that kind of focus on different, plant types. So flowers, grasses, shrubs, trees. And this is a picture of this is a screenshot of the wildflower tab. And it just goes through a list of the species that we grow and sell here and gives you some ideas on height and flower color and bloom time. And then also gives you some idea of what to expect in terms of drought tolerance, as well as what sort of sun exposure is preferred. So this is a great place to start. Lots of research can be done on this. It can be overwhelming because we've got 150 different species that we grow, so it's a lot to wade through. We also have lists on our website that just specifically list the species for different types of, wildlife. So we've got nectar plants for butterflies. We've got berry producers for birds. We've got several lists here on the website that if you've got a specific interest, you can select plants from this list. And then I found a really cool reference, and this is based on the research by Doug Tallamy, who is really spearheading a lot of good research in the eastern U.S. But he and his team have put together a list of plants by each ecoregion, and it's kind of just by genus. So, general, it's not down to the individual species level, but it gives you an idea of some species that support large numbers of caterpillars or pollinators, et cetera. And so this is just a screenshot of that list for ecoregion 10, which is the North American deserts ecoregion. That would kind of cover Wenatchee and east, kind of areas with, more of a desert landscape surrounding. And it's just really cool to see like the diversity of species that, like, say, a willow supports, or a choke cherry. So this is just a really fun thing to think about when planning a native landscape, to think about all the different species that you could potentially be supporting. Okay, so we're going to dive right in and talk about these example plant palettes. I've selected all of these species because they are, from my experience here at the nursery and, maintaining the landscape around the nursery, they're relatively easy to grow. And because of that, they're generally available for sale, if not at my nursery, at other nurseries. Okay, so for that sunny, low elevation landscape, so this is kind of Wenatchee, east, to Ephrata, maybe kind of curling around the south side of Lake Chelan up to Manson. Low elevation, pretty dry habitat, full sun. My favorite tree to grow is Douglas maple. We found that this is the most heat tolerant and um, probably most drought tolerant, although it is still a tree and you are gardening in the desert, and so there's just going to be watering. It's still going to require water. You're growing a tree in an area where shrubs, low growing shrubs and grasses are the predominant feature. So it's going to take a little bit more, but we all want trees in our yard for shade, to make the yard more pleasant. So this is one of my top picks. They get about 30 feet tall, 10 feet wide. They're pretty columnar, really. Shrubby, quite shrubby if you don't prune the lower branches. This picture that I found has a beautiful reddish tone. I've not really seen that much in our local maples. It's generally a green that kind of turns yellow in the fall. So maybe not quite as pretty as this picture here. Larger shrubs that work great are, of course, serviceberry. Everybody should have a serviceberry in their yard that's just covered in these white blooms in the spring. In fact, if you look at the foothills around Wenatchee in the spring and you see kind of a shrub with white blooms on it, that's all serviceberry. It's just a showstopper when it's in bloom, and then it produces berries that are edible, called Saskatoons, that you can eat. They're quite tasty, and they provide a tremendous amount of food for wildlife. So that's a great one. A couple other larger shrubs are Schooler's willow, mock orange. I'm not going to have time to go into every species, but we will have this list available, and this presentation as a PDF, and so you guys will be able to come back and consult this. But yeah, there's so many to go into. I'm just going to kind of talk about my absolute favorites. So serviceberry, absolutely. So for shorter shrubs, if you're looking for something, 6 feet or less, the currants are hard to beat. They bloom really early in the season, so they're great early season pollen source. And then they both create berries that are edible. I can't vouch for how choice they are. Some people eat them, but yeah, going to be great food for wildlife. And then, of course, rabbit brush. Even though this, might be considered kind of a scrubby little shrub, if you're looking for pollen sources late in the summer and early fall, this is a really tough one to beat. In fact, if you look at that list from the National Wildlife Federation, this supports a lot of pollinators simply because it's blooming at a time of year when there isn't a whole lot going on. So gray rabbit brush, green rabbit brush is another species that grows here. Those are both great options for that late summer, early fall bloom. Okay, perennials. Everybody loves orange globe mallow, showstopper with the orange kind of unique color and the grayish green leaves. These ones are pretty easy to grow. They can be hard to get the seed to germinate sometimes, and so I've struggled a little bit keeping them in stock just because getting them to grow from seed is a challenge. But once you get them established in your yard, they're pretty hardy and just really extended bloom time. They're wonderful in the landscape. Blue flax, not to be confused with like a European blue flax. This is the native blue flax, also called Lewis's flax. This one's just got a really unique texture to the leaves. Absolute beautiful, kind of extended little cornflower blue flower. My favorite penstemon, actually, I have lots of favorite penstemons. There's too many to pick from, but this is a really unique one just because it grows and it grows in really harsh sites. It's growing out of a retaining wall here. We've collected seed for this out of like sheer basalt cliffs in the Columbia Basin. Just an amazingly hardy plant. Um, and this particular species blooms in midsummer. And so most of the other penstemons are blooming in the spring. And so this one is a good one to include, particularly if you've got a dry, hot site, if you want to see some blooms in the midsummer. Sunset hyssop. So this is a little bit of a cheat because this is actually native to the desert Southwest. But this is a really unique one, supports a lot of hummingbirds, and it's another bloomer all the way into the fall up to first frost. So again, it can be kind of challenging to get those late season bloomers. And so this is one that we're willing to kind of step outside of the central Washington area to support just because it's just got such an extended bloom time into the fall. And yeah, absolutely show-stopping kind of pinkish peach flower colors. This one's a really unique species and it's native to the desert Southwest, so it's extremely drought tolerant. Snow buckwheat blooms all the way into the fall. Really drought tolerant as well. It grows naturally on sand dunes all around gravel fields, so it likes well-drained soils, but extremely hardy once established. Any other buckwheat. All the buckwheats are great choices for this low elevation, sunny type of site. Fleabane daisies. These species do support a tremendous number of pollinators. There's a lot to choose from. Most of them are going to be spring flowers, except threadleaf fleabane does bloom a little bit later into the summer, so that's a really good one to include. And then bunch grasses are just a great option for adding, some texture and structure to a landscape, kind of in and amongst your other perennials. These are two of my favorites. Indian rice grass, which it's on the right side there. It just has a kind of pretty feathery texture to the seed heads, and those do persist through the winter. So really, really nice texture all season long. And then, of course, annuals. These are always good options. They're typically going to be sown as seeds, so you'll buy seed packets. But these are great options to include in a garden, particularly early in the garden's lifespan, just because they're going to pop up and flower relatively quickly and also flower well into the summer and kind of help fill in while the rest of your garden might be establishing from small plants to full-size landscape plants. So these are really fun ones to include, these species here. Most of these can be purchased from online vendors like northwestmeadowscapes.com or Western Native Seeds are two really good options for these. And then, of course, ground covers. I personally think that bunch grasses like blue bunch wheatgrass and Indian rice grass are the best ground covers. But another option that's great for wildlife is kinnikinick. That one's definitely going to need some supplemental irrigation in lower elevation sites, but it does extremely well. Okay. So we're going to pause here and answer a few questions about this specific suite of plants. Is there anything in the chat?
None in the chat yet, but give everybody a second here if you want to have any questions about those specific plants or the locations. I'm going to put in the chat the Wildlife Foundation's Plant Finder URL.
Thank you.
Mary Pat says I have trouble with pest. I guess that's what that says.
Pests.
Mary Pat, do you want to unmute and ask that? I think. Susan asked if you could repeat the names of the ground covers versus connect.
Yes. So, bunch grasses, blue bunch wheatgrass and Indian rice grass are two really hardy, drought tolerant grasses. They're not going to form like a continuous layer, like a spreading ground cover like kinnikinnick, but they're really great at kind of, holding their space and competing with weeds in the little tuft that they grow in. So I personally use bunch grasses as a ground cover, just to, kind of keep things in check in my home landscape.
And asked if any particular native plants that are good for shady spots in Wenatchee.
A tough one, because that's not a natural environment, right? Desert and shade. I think when we get to the shadier site palette that we're just about to get into, I think a lot of what we'll talk about there is going to be applicable to that spot in Wenatchee, with kind of the added caveat that they'll need more water because, we get a lot less water in Wenatchee naturally, through rain and snow than we do in, say, Leavenworth or Lake Wenatchee. But the shade is pretty critical, and you've got to follow the shade needs of your plants for sure. So we will address that.
And Sean asked, "Hey Sean, how you doing? Do you have any recommendations for how to establish native annuals depending on the existing conditions of the landscape?"
Yeah. So by seed is going to be the easiest, most cost-effective way to do it. And we'll talk specifically about seeding in the kind of nuts and bolts portion of the presentation and what you're kind of looking for in an area where you're going to be seeding. So I'm going to defer that question as well.
And Mary Pat, back to that question. So she said she has trouble with pests. So I'm not sure if you have any specific. Mary Pat, do you want to unmute and ask that specific question? Maybe not. Okay, hang on.
There's definitely a lot of pests that everybody deals with in gardening with natives or ornamentals or garden plants. I try to think of it kind of like flip the script on that and think, oh, look at all the habitat I'm providing for this particular species. If it's aphids, oh, look at all the aphids I'm producing for, the nesting birds in the area. When it gets to the point of damaging the plants, that's a different issue, but often it's just unsightly. And if you let it go, a balance will develop. If your aphid population gets out of hand, all of a sudden, or at least this is what we see at the nursery here, lacewings just explode, and all of a sudden, a particular area will be covered in lacewings. I guess it would depend on what particular issue the pests were causing, and I'd be happy to talk to Mary Pat about that offline if she'd like to email me or call. So
okay, sounds good.
I'm going to move on, and we'll talk about the kind of upper valley shadier sites. Big leaf maple and vine maple are good fits for this, particularly the vine maple for shade. That species does really well in shade. I would say partial shade. I think that's defined as like 4 to 6 hours of sunlight. Correct me if I'm wrong. But so some sun, not 100% shade, but these are species that do great with that shade. Vine maple has great fall color. So it's just one of our most popular species, turns kind of like crimson red in the fall. And it's pretty small, so it fits in a lot of kind of more small urban lots. They're going to be 10 to 25-ish feet tall, and then usually about 15 or 20 feet wide. And you can kind of, make them more columnar by encouraging less stems at the base by kind of pruning selectively. Um, Large shrubs, I've got Schooler's willow there again because willows are just such awesome hosts. Serviceberry, mock orange both do great as well. Serviceberry and mock orange are both going to do okay in partial shade. I've seen mock orange flower a little bit less in like a really shady site, whereas in full sun, it's just a really vibrant flower. But it will still do well there. And then you can start to add in species like red osier dogwood, which is a really easy species to grow, and it also does well in partial shade. It's going to need a little bit more water, but it's a really fast-growing species. We recommend this a lot for screening. This is a picture of a shrub in our landscape here at the nursery, and it's got so many stems coming up from the base of the plant that even though it is deciduous, it acts as a pretty effective screen even in the winter. Lots of great medium kind of height shrubs, high bush cranberry, the currants again, red flowering currant in particular starts to be a better species to grow because it does better in partial shade than in a really hot full sun site. At least I found. And ocean spray is another beautiful shrub that blooms in the summer. So it's a little bit unique. These are shrubs that are all going to be in that 4 to 6 foot range. So kind of medium height shrubs. And then great smaller shrub that would do well in partial shade is snowberry. You got to be a little careful with this species because it is hedge forming. So it will send up shoots. But if you've got a large area or a hillside or, an area where it can roam around, this is a really beautiful species to grow. And it's really going to top out about 3 feet maximum. Perennials, all the penstemons, 3 species of penstemon that do great in a little more moist, shadier sites are Venus, Chelan, and Shrubby. Shrubby penstemon is, a penstemon that grows in the, ponderosa pine forests all around the area. It's just a beautiful, all bloom in the spring. Buckwheats again, maybe snow buckwheat might not do as well, like up by Lake Wenatchee, because it needs really well-drained soils, but sulfur, creamy, and strict all occur naturally around the Upper Valley. And then my favorite species, they're all my favorite. Let's be honest. Two really great showy species are the showy fleabane, the kind of purple aster on the right side there, and then blanket flower. These are just 2 really adaptable and extremely showy species. The fleabane is going to bloom in the spring, and the blanket flower does bloom through the summer. So really great ones to include in the home landscape. Leafy bract aster, I don't have a picture of that for some reason. That's going to bloom all the way into the late summer. Douglas aster, a lot of the asters do bloom all the way through the summer and into fall, so those are great ones to include. Again, grasses are great ground covers. two really great ones to include with shade and more moisture are pine grass. Pine grass is the kind of really bright green, shiny grass that you see growing around Lake Wenatchee, kind of under the ponderosa pines. And then Idaho fescue, which is a little tufted grass, but does well in full sun or partial shade. And annuals again, you just can't go wrong with including some annuals in your landscape. Kinnikinnick grows naturally in the forest, does great with some partial shade. And wild strawberry is a really fun one to grow with quite a bit of shade. This is a species that grows in really shady sites in the forest. And it's just a great spreading species. Whether or not you actually pick strawberries off of it is questionable, but it is pretty effective ground cover. Pause quickly with any questions on those species.
Give everybody a second here. I don't see any new ones.
Again, this list of plants, I'm sorry we went through those so quickly. I wanted to save some time for kind of the practicalities of planting. But this information will all be available. Kirk sends out the PDF.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mel.
Yeah, I was just gonna say you send a PDF out within a week or so with the presentation. So this information will be on it. So moving on to how to get these plants into your landscape. Seeds are one option. This generally isn't the most effective way to do it in a home landscape, but it is in certain situations. So seeds are mainly appropriate for larger scale projects, like if you've got, Are you guys still seeing my presentation?
No, we have a big gray box.
Oh no, it just crashed.
Uh-oh.
How about now?
Yep, they're back.
Okay, good. Whew. I don't know what happened there. So on a larger scale, like if you're looking at like removing a chunk of your lawn and just putting in some sort of drought tolerant grass, and you're looking at, thousands of square feet, seeds are a good choice. Grasses in particular are pretty easily seeded. A lot of native species have tricky germination issues. And so they needed to be seeded in a really specific window, particularly a lot of the wildflower and shrub seeds. But grasses generally can be seeded, any time of the year. And as long as it's kept moist, will germinate pretty readily. So grasses and annual wildflowers are typically seeded just because it's such a short-lived plant. It's kind of hard to justify, planting it as a live plant. The cost is a lot more reasonable with just a seed packet. Some of the native annual wildflowers are going to need to be seeded in the fall, and some of them can be seeded in the spring or some. It just kind of depends on what species, and so generally the label will say, but like tick seed and annual sunflowers, those do great seeded at any time of the year, whereas both of the bee plants need to be seeded in the fall. I think the Clarkias can be seeded in the spring, so you just have to kind of keep that in mind. If you want to look at annuals, you probably should purchase your packets in the fall, and then just if you need to seed them in the fall, you'll have them, and if not, you can hang on to them. And then live plants are what's typically used for kind of small to medium scale projects, as well as species that are challenging to establish from seed, like wildflowers and shrubs. Shrubs have all sorts of issues with dormancy. Sometimes they need to pass through the intestinal tract of a bird or a bear, and then go through winter conditions in order to germinate. And so just, harvesting some berries from your hike in the woods and planting them in your yard is going to be pretty underwhelming. And that goes for a lot of the wildflowers as well. Although there's a few wildflowers that do pretty well from seed, and those include like the lupins and balsam root. And we can talk a little bit about how to collect them and when to seed them. You're going to want to do it in the fall for sure. But those do pretty well from seed if you can get your site prepared correctly. So site preparation is key if you want to seed. This is a little area that I seeded at the nursery a few years ago. And I raked the soil until it was really loose, and you can kind of see my footprint there in the middle. And I took a step, and what you're looking for is, a little bit of fluff that you can sink into, a nice 1/2 inch or inch to have that nice kind of fluffy seed bed. And it's totally bare. There's no existing like lawn grass or weeds. It's basically in a blank slate. So yeah, you need excellent site preparation in order to get good establishment when you're using seeds. So that's what you're looking for. Live plants, obviously, you don't need that level of site preparation. You can, do a lot less and get away with like heavily mulching to control weeds. But so yeah, these are definitely two kind of pros and cons for these different plant materials. How to purchase your plants. Obviously, I would love for you to come visit us at my nursery in Peshastin, but there's a lot of other nurseries out there as well. And the Washington Native Plant Society maintains a list that they update annually. So if you go to this link here, they will go through, you can go through statewide and look at all of the various nurseries that sell live plants or seeds. And it's just a tremendous resource. There's a ton of different nurseries in Western Washington, not as many in Eastern Washington. There's really only a handful, but on the west side of the state, there's a lot of good options. Timing of planting is something that is really critical to think about. I know we're coming into spring. We've all been inside all winter. We're all excited to get out and plant, but we probably should have planted in fall. Just kidding. Fall is the best time to plant, particularly for lower elevation sites like the Wenatchee area and surrounding area. And, that's because it's, you put the plants in the ground in, say, October, and the ground might not freeze regularly, for all but like a month or two in the winter. And so that entire, winter season, unless the ground's frozen, there is root growth happening with those plants. Installing the plants in the fall really gives them an edge. And I can say, as a nursery producer, my availability is so much better in the fall because I have all spring and summer to produce these plants, and I can make them large and beautiful and well-rooted. Whereas in the spring, we're only growing plants for about a month before people are really, clamoring to get them and get them planted. So availability and having that leg up on root growth through the winter is really, really, really key. I always say that, you shouldn't be planting unless you're like geared up like my friend Linda is here in this picture with like, several layers and insulated pants. That's planting season. And that's because a lot of the native plants in our area, they're most active in the fall, winter, and spring, because that's when we get all of our rainfall and snowfall. It's when all of our precipitation comes down. So we have hot, dry summers. And so a lot of our plants are not very active at that time of the year. They're harder to get established. They're trickier. It can be done, but it's trickier. So I always say fall or spring. Fall is best, particularly in that kind of late September, early October window when, you've got enough time for root growth before things start to get really cold. Seeding in particular is most effective anytime during that kind of dormant time of the year, when temperatures are really cold. So like right around Halloween all the way until probably the end of January. And it's called a dormant seeding because the seeds are, left in the soil and they're not doing anything. They're not germinating when it's that cold, but they're in place. And as soon as the soil temperatures warm up and they get that shot of spring moisture, they're off and running and they're putting roots down. You don't have to wait, a month or two after the snow melts for them to start popping up. So dormant season seeding is really the most effective way to go. Obviously, if you have the ability to irrigate your site, you can plant any time of the year. But those hot months are tricky, particularly for a lot of the low elevation shrub step plants, because they are just not naturally active at that time of the year. They are going dormant or really slowing down on growth, so it makes them hard to establish. Planting method is going to be similar to any plant, any ornamental plant, digging a great big hole and not backfilling with any rocks, and making sure the plant stem goes in at the right height, just right there at soil level. Betsy had some great recommendations for maybe doing that a little bit differently with really clay soils. And I would encourage you to watch her presentation if you have questions about that. I get so many questions about how do I amend my soil? And for the most part, you don't need to. If your site is highly disturbed because it's a new construction and it's been all graded and, there's just a bunch of subsoil that's now on the surface. Yeah, I think, amending with some compost on top would be appropriate. But for most sites and planting into existing landscapes, native soil is fine for native plants. There's this idea that, you need to add compost and all of these amendments. And for the most part, that is not the case. And so just tamp lightly, create a nice watering basin so that it can catch a large amount of water and slowly let it filter into the soil. And water it in really well. Any sort of compost or slow release fertilizer is just the surface. But again, it's not really recommended if you've got intact topsoil. And mulching is great. This is really one of the best things that you can do to, increase the kind of low maintenance, to reduce maintenance. Mulch kind of moderates soil temperatures. It helps with weed competition. It's really, really going to be, really effective if you want a low maintenance landscape. Usually 2 to 3 feet around the plant and 1 to 2 inch depth, and it's going to degrade over time. And if at that point your landscape is starting to fill in, then maybe you leave it. And you leave it, more bare, and you provide that habitat for ground nesting bees. Or if your landscape's not quite ready with that, you can always add more. Rock is appropriate if you've got concerns about fire, like right around the house site within kind of that zone 1, 0 to 5 feet from the house. And Al will talk a little bit more about kind of firewising and wildfire mitigation risk in his presentation later this month. Or I really like, arborist wood chips or some sort of shredded wood mulch if you're a little further away from the house. We typically don't recommend any sort of like landscape fabric. It doesn't stop weeds from blowing in on top, weed seeds from blowing in on top and germinating. All it's going to do is stop like existing vegetation from growing up through it. And it's, yeah, it stops kind of the oxygen flow, between the air and the soil. And so it's just not a healthy long-term fix. We just don't just try to stay away from it if you can. Protection from animals is key. And maybe even going back and like planning, if you have heavy deer issues at your site, you got to be a lot more uh, thoughtful about selecting species that are not, high deer browse possibilities. And if you do and you have deer issues, all plants, natives as well as ornamentals, need to be protected until they're of sufficient size that they can kind of be above any sort of deer browse line. Irrigation is going to be important, even if you plant really drought tolerant plants. You're still going to need to water them for 1 to 2 years to get them established. So if you've got any sort of larger landscape area to cover, some sort of installed system is ideal with drips or micro sprinklers. We try to discourage any sort of broadcast irrigation unless you've got kind of that large seeded area that you're working on, like if you seeded a large area of grass in particular. But in general, broadcast irrigation is going to water a whole lot of weeds as well as your landscape plants. So drip irrigation is ideal if you can make that work. And then I think Betsy said this last week, but start with really minimal watering and, see if you need to go up from there, but water as little as possible to begin with, because you just can't, if you're watering every other day in May, you're going to get really shallow root growth. And then when it's July and it's 105, I mean, it's hard to go up from there. You'll be watering twice a day. It's just as watering as little as possible for longer sets encourages moisture to go down into the profile, and it kind of letting the soil dry out between watering cycles encourages roots to kind of go down into the soil profile to follow that water, and that's what's going to lend you to drought tolerance in the future. And so start minimally, and watering should be guided by monitoring. So digging down a little bit. Is it still moist? Okay, I'm not going to water. I'll check back. Try not to get into a set schedule right off the bat. You'll be able to develop a schedule over time, but early on in the process, let the plants guide you, let the soils and temperature and monitoring of the soil moisture guide you. Initial design of your system is going to be absolutely critical. Deciding where you place your plants is critical. So like within a drip irrigation line, you really need to have species that are going to need to be watered at the same frequency. So this is Indian rice grass and red osier dogwood. And these are like two species on the opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of water needs for natives that we deal with. The Indian rice grass is going to be completely drought tolerant. You might want to water it once a month just to kind of keep it green in the summer. Whereas the red osier dogwood is going to need to be watered weekly, at least. I've got some in my yard, and the drip line that it's on waters it weekly, and I could probably water it a little bit more and it would grow a little faster, but we're content with that on city water. So that's something that absolutely has to be taken into account with your planting plan and design and your irrigation system design. You can put larger emitters if you want to water one plant more, like a half gallon per hour, or 2 gallons per hour, but you can't really change that frequency. So the frequency definitely needs to be taken into account. And a good place to start with for monitoring, right after you've planted your landscape is to check maybe every 4 to 5 days to see if more watering is needed. Maintenance, it really depends on what you're looking for in terms of your landscape. Obviously, watering as little as you can get away with. We always recommend pruning species that are dead, diseased, damaged. Pruning for shape, really only after they're well established, for several growing seasons. You can native shrubs are very tolerant to pruning, so you certainly can prune. But ideally it should be done during the dormant season because pruning encourages more growth of the plant. And so it can be stressful to them if you prune during the active season when they're leafed out. But again, if you've got dead, diseased, or damaged plants, you should prune those at any time of the year. In terms of spring cleanup, cut back your perennials as late as you can, just to, provide that, leaf litter or stems for nesting insects. One thing to keep in mind is that they definitely need to be cleaned up in like a fire zone, like a zone 1 right by the house when fire season comes around. But as late as in the season as possible. But which, lends me to my last thought, and that, do we really need our landscape to be cleaned up and manicured? And I just want everybody to kind of think about that and kind of like, let's change our thoughts about what landscape should look like, or at least, try to think about it differently. Think about it as habitat and not messy. If you're, approaching native plant gardening with the idea of creating habitat, that should be the focus rather than this really manicured, immaculate look, kind of like a living room rather than a yard. Again, caveat to Firewise Zone 1, which is right around the house where it does need to be clean and green. But then don't go too far in the other direction. You do have to, native plant or natural gardening doesn't, give you an excuse to just let everything go wild. That's a great recipe to have issues with your neighbors. And so consider, including in a really, natural landscape, these cues to care, such as a mowed path through a meadow or a stone gravel pathway, habitat signs that you are caring actively for your landscape, and not just kind of letting it go completely wild. So I didn't leave a whole lot of time for more questions, but I can certainly answer some real quick if anybody is still around and interested.
Everybody's still here. So,
Okay.
yeah. Looking back at some of the earlier questions. So there was one question about somebody in Leavenworth has a very sunny front yard. Will lower valley plants do well?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't do Indian rice grass in Leavenworth unless you've got like a really rocky, sandy, hot site, like a really well drained site. I haven't found Indian rice grass to be a species that does well outside of that type of niche. So yeah, possibly if you've got a very specific microsite, but probably not.
And Deborah asked about, do the plants do well in silty soils? That's Betsy's talk from last week.
Yeah. Silty or clay soils have like their unique challenges, and Betsy has a list of plants that do better in like that kind of clay soil type versus another list for sands. And, obviously it's the drainage that's the critical issue there. So I would say look at Betsy's recommendations for that because they were really well put together.
And your thoughts on planting sagebrush, pros and cons of sagebrush?
It's flammable. It's like got turpentine in the leaves. So and you got to be really careful using that in a small urban landscape. I wouldn't recommend it with acreage outside of like a firewise, zone. I think Al could weigh in on what zone you would want to plant that in. Probably 3+, I'm guessing. I don't know. Al, do you want to weigh in on that real quick?
Yeah,
But
it'd be okay in zone 3, but I wouldn't put it in any closer than 30 feet from the house, at least 30 feet from the house. In fact, there was another question there that I could help you answer if you want, it's in reference to all the plants that Mel's talked about are good firewise plants with one exception, and that being rabbit brush. And if you keep that out 30 feet from the house, it's fine. It's great. But all the other ones are wonderful firewise plants, fire resistant plants, I should say.
yeah, deciduous plants in particular is kind of the focus of this presentation. So yeah, those are generally going to be better in that situation. Yeah, so I mean, the sagebrush has a lot of value as well, and I personally love it. But yeah, 30 feet plus from the house, extremely drought tolerant. I mean, obviously, sagebrush grows in eastern Washington with no assistance from anybody. But yeah, 30 feet plus.
Great. Any other questions?
I see this question about firewise considerations, and I think I talked a little bit about cleanup, like keeping that zone 1 clean and green. And we just talked about, a few more of the more flammable plants and where those should be in relation to the house. And yeah, I think Al, you're going to be hitting on this more. So his presentation's at the end of the month. So to really get an in-depth look into Firewise and the zones and the maps. That would be a good presentation to catch.
I actually just see another question I missed earlier. Is native phlox easy to propagate?
No, it is not. That's why we don't have it. It's actually easy to grow if you can collect the seed, but it has what's called explosive dehiscence, which means the seeds go when they're ready. And they shoot out. Lupins do this too, but lupins can be collected a lot more easily early on and let mature, kind of in a bin. But phlox is not so much. I used to work on a seed farm and we grew phlox, longleaf phlox, and we had to grow it in, heavy duty weed control fabric and cover it with tulle or like veil material, wedding veil material. And then it would explode out and then we'd come through and like vacuum it from the ground cover. And that was the only way. So it's not bad to grow and it's beautiful. And I wish I could do a better job of collecting seeds. If anybody has any seeds or, wants to hook me up some seeds, I'd be glad to try to grow from them. But the seed collection is the challenging bit. So.
All right. I'm not seeing any more questions and it's 8 after 8. So if any other last minute ones, we'll call it a night.